Good morning, Legacy viewers. This morning's video was recorded at Umkomaas, wonderful view over the sea. And it's actually more of a conversation between Dr. Anthony Turton, who we've interviewed before from National Intelligence, and Dale van den Aardweg, who was a signaller in 1975, thereabouts. So I'm going to hand over to Anthony and they can go ahead.
Okay, good morning, good people. My name is Anthony Turton, and it's my pleasure today to interview someone who I met a while back when I was doing some commercial work on his farm up on the Tugela River. That's a story in its own right, because his farm is actually where Buller crossed the Tugela River to go and relieve Ladysmith. But we don't want to go down that rabbit hole at the moment, because there are a couple of other rabbit holes we're going to go down. So what we're going to talk about today is four battles that were, in my opinion, extremely important from a strategic point of view in the overall Bush War. And if you can understand those four battles, then you can start benchmarking the other issues that happened around them. So, of those four battles, the interview we're going to do today, the interviewee was involved in two of those four. So let's just quickly go through the four battles. So the first battle that was very, very important was right in the beginning of the war, a place called Ongulumbushi. Ongulumbushi was very important because at that point in time, it was quite clear that the police could no longer control the situation in the liberation war of Namibia, and for the first time, South African soldiers were deployed. One of them was Colonel Jan Breitenbach, who was deputized as a policeman, and that then saw special forces being deployed in. So Battle of Ongulumbushi, we're not going to talk about that today. And then the second one is a battle that many listeners or viewers will not be aware of. It's called the Battle of Kifangongo. And that was right at the start of the war. And the significance of Kifangongo was it was the first time that the South African Navy got involved in the Bush War. But it also was a time when there was a split between the intelligence services of South Africa and the CIA. CIA basically betrayed the South African intelligence forces, and there was a big major split, and that's of great importance in the subsequent narrative about whether the SADF was a surrogate force of the United States. But that we're going to talk about that today. Then the third battle was Battle of Ebo. And the Battle of Ebo was down in the sort of central eastern part of Angola, and that was right in the early phases of Savannah. And the significance of Ebo was that was the first deployment of the Cubans in any structure, and they blunted the advance of the South African forces. At that point in time, a battle group known as Foxbat was blunted. And there are a lot of interesting things happened there, and we're going to talk about that today. And then the fourth one was the Battle of the Lomba. And the Battle of the Lomba, the significance of that was that South African forces effectively destroyed two Fopler brigades as a fighting force, forced them into a defensive position at Quito-Quanavale, thereby denying them the victory that they wanted over UNITA, and thereby basically clutching victory out of the jaws of defeat, if you want to use that sort of expression. So today we're going to talk about just those two middle battles. I'm going to allow my guest to just introduce himself. He was a lieutenant during that period of time, and he was a signaller. So please tell us who you are.
Anthony, nice being with you guys, and the memories are long back, but we'll try and recall them. My name's Dale van den Aardweg, and by profession I'm an agriculturalist, so my memory might fade in certain circumstances, but I'm sure we'll pull the thing together and give you our experiences. I was called up to national service in 1975, January intake, and to Heidelberg, and went through the normal rungs of officers' course. And while we were on officers' course as COs, and we were sort of on the final stages of our training, suddenly we were called as a group together, and they said to us, al die Engelsmanne to the left, al die Afrikaners na die regterkant. So we thought, geez, is this now back to the Boer War again with the English separating us as English and Afrikaans? And then they just said, okay, the English guys, you're going to go on a special ops. And we thought it was part of our training, so we weren't really prepared. We thought we'd been doing these sort of things verbatim all the time. So it was nothing abnormal. We got into a Bedford, no kit. They told us to leave our rifles behind, and we left Heidelberg. The next thing, we had Whitaker hoogte, and we needed some lunch. They said, well, you'll have to go into the Salvi and get some lunch, a little bit of lunch there. And to cut a long story short, it wasn't quite nightfall, but it was the end of the day. We were on a flossie, and we weren't even sure where we were going to. We'd taken off from Waterkloof base. And from there, we went up to Rundu. We landed there. We were most probably a day in Rundu. And then they said to us, we must take all our South African identikit and replace it with foreign identikit. We still weren't told what we were going to be doing. So we got rid of our browns. We had no webbing. Our rifles were left in Heidelberg. So basically we came there with just the clothes we were wearing, and we changed those. And these were the shoes that I was given. So I'm a size 10. These are size 8. So they didn't have my right shoe size. So I had to cut the toes out so that I could fit into those shoes. And when at a later stage I got the cap from a Mozambican Fletcher. So all these little bits of memorabilia bring back good memories. But to cut a long story short, from there we flew in a Dakota with radio equipment. Some of the stuff we knew, some of the stuff we didn't know. There was new stuff that had come in from apparently the CSRR, like the hopper equipment and that, and we suddenly had to try and give a brief understanding of how the stuff worked. But it was loaded, and we went up with Dakota to Sela. And at Sela we were commissioned and told that we had to get comms going between Sela and Rundu and Pretoria. So when we landed there, we were actually quite shocked, because there was not really military, but there were a whole lot of let's call them vegetable type trucks or cattle trucks that were waiting at the airport for us, and multicolored. They were red and green and blue. It was actually quite scenic seeing all these trucks. Anyway, we clambered on board these trucks with our equipment, and they took us to a house near the hospital in Sela, and we set up base there. And what was interesting, we had no rat packs or anything. We just had what we were wearing. And we were starting to feel a bit hungry. And so the guy said, well, there's lots of bananas and pawpaws you can eat. So that's what we basically lived on for a while, because the logistics hadn't been catered for at this point in time. So, and then we said, well, where are we going to sleep? So the guy said, well, you're setting up this house, but the best place is actually to go to the hospital and see if you can find some sheets and some blankets there. Although it was very hot and humid, it was tropical environment. We sauntered off to the hospital, and lo and behold, that's where we got the shock of our lives, because we hadn't realized that there was a civil war going on in Angola. We weren't told about it. We were just told we've got to get comms going. And when we walked into this hospital, we found people that died in the passages, people who were half dead in the beds and groaning. And wherever we tried to find a decent bit of bedding, there was nothing, because it had been soiled, or people were lying dead in their own blood in the hospital, sort of thing. And it was terrible. We found people with their limbs missing, and then they'd sort of tried to walk down or tried to get away, and there was blood all in the corridors. It was a dreadful sight. So we just said, we can't handle this. It was a shock to our system. So we walked outside and we found a little building, and we thought, well, let's make this our headquarters for sleeping. And so we found this building, and when we opened the doors, we realized it was a mortuary. And all the bunks were in this mortuary. There was one or two guys there, and we removed them, and then we realized this place we could clean up and live here and not be contaminated. So then we had to go and find our linen inside the hospital. We built our bed. So we slept in this mortuary for about a week. But what was interesting was that after we'd set up communication, they then said we need to get mobile communication going. So we said, well, where's the jeeps or whatever? They said, no. You're going to go into cellar and you're going to find yourself a vehicle there and try and hot wire it. So we walked into cellar, looking around in the town, and it was horrific because the Portuguese had fled like you won't believe. There was, where we got a Honda. I don't know, these little 4x4 Hondas. We rigged that thing up with radios and things for the OC. And this little Honda was standing in the window of a garage being exhibited to be sold. And it was just, they just left it there. They'd left all this capital and fled. So we hot wired the Honda, and we got it started, and we fitted it out with radios and things. And then we started also being adventurous, went into the towns to see what was going on there. And it was like a death town. You'd go into a homestead and you'd find everything there, all the furniture, beds, everything, but no people. People had all fled. And then we even heard about, remember they speak Portuguese, we'd heard about a cheese factory, so we went up to the cheese factory to see if we could get some cheese maybe. And all the cheese there was rotting because the refrigeration systems were off and so on. So it was really sad to see the way the whole thing had actually become deprivtive, if you want to call it. But anyway, those were our introductions into a state that had civil war. And it's always left an impression on my mind is that one doesn't want to get to that situation in our own country, because it's a lesson that I've learned. It's not worth it. It's shocking at the end of the day.
Okay, so you were initially deployed to Sela, and we're going to get back to Sela now, because you were then redeployed from there. Am I correct?
Correct.
So let's say so Sela, that's ultimately near the Battle of Ibo later on. So you moved from Sela up to Ambrise. So let's talk about the Ambrise part, because that, in terms of the historic timeline, happened before the rest of it. So just tell us about how you then redeployed from Sela up to Ambrise and the whole story about Ambrise.
Well, while we were in Sela, we had a guy called Sergeant Major Hutting, who was excellent. I had such an amazing rapport for the man. He just was so intricate and articulate and precise about everything. And if it hadn't been for him, we were still rookies. We were still learning the game. We wouldn't have known how to have set ourselves up. But anyway, he came alongside me and he said they needed to start a base at various other places, because there was only like half a dozen of us, or maybe a dozen, I can't remember, of us signalers. And so some of the guys had to go to Orange, some of the guys had to go to Alpha, some of the guys had to go down to Bravo. and give support there on the.
So those are the different battle groups.
Yes.
Battle Group Orange and Battle Group.
Yeah. And Foxbat hadn't started then yet. Foxbat and Zulu was still sort of being
forming. They were still
formed,
sort of coalescing.
Yeah, they were still in formation. Anyway, and he said, he wants to send me up to Umbriz, and that was called, in those days, they called it Sector 30. Sorry, Sector 3. Sector 3, I think it was. And that we had to start a base there with communication. What's interesting is we only realized after we'd set up everything in Celle why they chose the English guys, because the communication on radios had to be in English, not in Afrikaans. And that was sort of maybe to disguise our presence in Angola in a way, if we were detected. So that's why we realized it wasn't the Boer, the Boer and the Brit situation. It was the strategy there.
So Celle sort of central, southwest kind of a part of Angola, but then you now redeployed up to the far north.
Yes.
The far north. Okay, so this is the other side of Luanda. This is right up, close to the Congo. Okay,
yes.
So then tell us about that deployment now.
So we had to take radios with us, and then there was a King aircraft that came, and that's the first time that I met. I think he was Commandant Ruus at that stage.
De Wet Ruus.
De Wet Ruus, yeah. And there were other guys on the aircraft too, but I didn't know, who they were. And we loaded all the stuff, and then we flew. We flew for about an hour and a half with this King Air to get to Umbriz. And Umbriz is a runway like there was at Celle, and we landed there. It was a dirt runway, and then they took us to a house just off the runway to set up communication. And then, as time unfolded, you were hardly briefed, because all you had to do was set up communication. So we had our crypto units, and we had our HF units and VHF units that we set up for communication back to Rundu there as well, and to Pretoria. And but slowly, as things unfolded, we suddenly realized what we were getting ourselves into, and things started happening. Like at night, for instance, there were Hercules aircraft that would land, and there would be a whole lot of armaments that would be delivered on the runway there. And at this stage, I still didn't have a rifle, so I just had my shoes and and the stuff that I was basically wearing. We had no balsack or anything. And when all this stuff landed, we thought, well, now we can help ourselves to preparing ourselves. And it was an absolute shambles of stuff. I'd never seen this equipment, so it was obviously, I don't know if it was East German or whether it was Vietnamese stuff, but we started making plans. And for instance, I managed to get hold of a rifle, but it had a pan on it. I've never been trained in this thing. And I suddenly realized when you dismantled this thing, it had a spring inside. So all your bullets had to be sort of, but all these bullets that were still remaining in that thing were just all jumbled up inside the thing.
Was that a Russian PPSH?
Something like it. And then we suddenly realized, but the caliber isn't right, because the bullet actually rattles in the turret, in the barrel, So it was absolute chaos. And in fact, at one of the battles, the guys were using I think it was an East 25 pounder. It wasn't our 25 pounder, and the actual charge was overloaded, and the whole cannon exploded and killed all the personnel. It wasn't our personnel. I think it was people that came in. I think they were Chinese people, if I recall, because there was a whole contingent. There were Chinese people, there were Mozambique people that came to help Fletchers, and this is where I got the cap from, one of them. So eventually I got a cap. and we just wore my black PT shorts basically and a little jacket. There were the South Africans that were coming in to give a hand there. Then we realized that this King Air that we traveled in actually belonged to the CIA, and they were doing a monitoring of the ships coming into Luanda, counting the Aardweg coming in, and in the time that we were there, I mean, I went in there, I think it was roughly the middle of October, if I remember correctly. And that time to when we were evacuated, which was like the end of November, the amount of armaments that had come in was just unbelievable. And what was interesting to this builder was that Mobutu Sese Seko, I think that's what the president of the Congo, he was aligned with Holden Roberta, and they had an idea of forming their own province up in the north. I think it was called the Bengo province or something. And they wanted Cabinda, the oil fields, for themselves. So Mobutu used to fly in, but he flew in. When I spoke to one of the pilots, I said to them, "Where are you from?" So they said, "No, we're from De Beers." So De Beers Mining Company were actually supporting Mobutu at that stage, flying him around. And then, so you had that contingent that were vying for Cabinda. Then you had the FNLA guys who were under Holden Roberta, but they were so demotivated and ill-trained. And one of the challenges was that every time an aeroplane landed, and they were intoxicated, they were always drunk. Every time an aeroplane landed, they wanted to climb on board this thing. So so there was eventually we had to have a decoy keeping the people away from trying to climb on board the aircrafts when they came and delivered their hardware. It was
can I just explain into the listener what was actually happening at that point in time at strategic level? Was that the MPLA was very badly organized. In fact, they were almost a non-entity. UNITA was already working closely with the CIA, and they were quite well organized. And then there was the FNLA up in the north, and the FNLA was non-communist. So the Americans were very interested in the FNLA. They wanted the FNLA to actually march into Luanda and to basically capture Luanda without many shots being fired, because they believed that the MPLA was unable to respond correctly, and install a pro-Western government. That's what it was about. And then there was some diplomatic liaison that happened that most people would be unaware of. So that's why I'm explaining. Some of the diplomatic liaison was from the Mobutu Sese Seko, who actually reached out to the South African government, and he wanted South African government help. You must also appreciate at that point in time that our Prime Minister, Foster, had that very famous meeting of his with Kenneth Kaunda on the bridge. And in that meeting, there was also a request made for support for non-communist aligned governments in South Africa. So there was that force coming in. And then there was a third arm of that diplomatic engagement when the FNLA reached out to the South African embassy in London and officially requested artillery support. So the official request from the FNLA side was they wanted artillery support in order to march on the capital city, to capture the capital city, and thereby avert a civil war. So thereby, if that had have succeeded, then Operation Savannah wouldn't have been necessary. So we need to understand all of that, because all of these loose pieces are sort of floating around like bits and pieces of vegetable in a soup. So we just try to bring all of those together just to tell the coherent story. So it's in that background now that you've got the mining interests, you've got the foreign American interests, you've got all kinds of Chinese and all sorts of other governments that aren't yet clearly defined. And then into the mix now you've got the signals people. They don't quite know what's going on, but they just know that something big is happening. So right, back to you, because now Ben de Wet Rus. He played a very important role in ultimately that big battle, the artillery battle, and that artillery battle went completely wrong, and there's a whole lot of sort of fallout from that.
I just want to add to the confusion.
Yeah.
because I don't know if people realize that is what it was. It was total confusion because you had so many entities with interests there,
Yeah.
especially because of the Cabinda oil fields. I don't know, there was a chap which we only realized with his own, it was almost like those old Viscount Dakota type planes. He landed there. His name was Jack Mallock.
Okay.
And Jack Mallock was a Second World War pilot.
Okay.
But after the Second World War, he decided to become a gun runner. And there were boss agents from Bureau of State Security up there as well. And they had contacted him and said they need some of the trained Mozambican Fletchers that had left to come over. And so he recruited about 120, I think it was, they came in with that Viscount and landed there to support the call it the West, the endeavor of the West. And not only that, there were from the Belgium side, there were two pilots that had Alouettes that also came in. So you had the Belgians involved. You had
Okay, so it was a loose coalition.
It was
a loose
unbelievable.
coalition. The CIA was liaising at that time with Boss, and the CIA promised all kinds of support. And that's why I say this battle is so important, because this is the battle that, from an intelligence perspective, made it very clear to the South Intelligence Services that the CIA was untrustworthy, because the CIA basically abandoned everyone, abandoned the entire force. And in the process of abandoning the force, after this artillery battle, which I don't know if we'll talk about today, but there was this big artillery engagement. The engagement was a flop because after the rolling barrage, the FNLA were supposed to march through this wetland and then to go down to the capital city and capture it, but they didn't. They didn't get out of the trenches and they didn't march. And once all the ammo had been shot out, there was no more ammo. So the whole
the ammo didn't even register. It didn't work.
Okay, so there's that element. There's that element with suddenly now when the CIA up sticks and they run away. But before we get to that point, there's another very interesting part that I want to draw attention to now, is that you as a young radio officer now, you are setting up communications and you on top of the roof of a house, a Portuguese built house, and you're busy putting an antenna up, and you don't know who's in the room beneath you, and lo and behold, what happens there? I cue you up. You tell us the story about what happened then when you were setting up the antenna on the street.
There's some funny occasions too when you're in this situation. So we were just told that that night there was going to be a plane that was going to come in with VIPs, and that we had to move base. So we had to pull down everything and move it to a different venue, a different house. And so while we were busy putting everything together, okay, so we set up this house, and Constant Villian and Magnus had come up, and they were going to have a meeting now with Holden Roberta, and there were, I think Chipinda was there. There were a couple of important people there, and it was all about this attack that Anthony's been talking about on Colofong to take. And Independence Day was the 11th of November. That was like the center of the objective, is to take Luanda on Independence Day. So this whole contingent now arrived to set up this whole thing. But they have their meeting, and I think their meeting ends at about 10, 11 at night, and I'm still busy battling to string up my antennas and to get the frequencies right and position and so on. And we're on this old house, and the roof gives way, and I fall through the tiles of this roof, through the ceiling, and old Constant has just got into bed, and I fall right on top of him, and I stuff up his bed, and he's not impressed. He thought that there's a mortar that comes through the roof. He almost wanted to bliksem me. And anyway, to cut a long story short, we laughed and so on. But interestingly enough, I was at the Grain Congress and Constant came.
Okay.
He was representing his sector. Yeah, and he looked at my face. This is now after, I don't know, 20 or 30 years. And he looked at me and said, you know what, I'll never forget your face. He says, that night I thought I was going to
so
be dead.
in that mix now, there's lots of stuff happening, lots of high-level people are coming in, decisions are being made now. Okay, then there's a guy called Stockwell. So he was the CIA man. So tell us about Stockwell.
Stockwell was in and out of Embrez all the time. He seemed to be a sort of liaison officer. We had another chap there, a colonel, I'm just trying to think of his name now. There were two of them that were doing the surveillances, and he was, integrating with them. But he was supposedly, from what I understand, the main man that was talking to Kissinger at the end of the day and giving direct information of what was actually going on with the CIA in Angola. And he was on lots of the ops meetings as well, when they had ops meetings with Holden Roberto and Brigadier Ruiz. So yeah.
Okay, so just to give some insight now, so at that point in time you must appreciate that the CIA was divided. There was not a common vision about what should happen. The Americans had just pulled out of Vietnam. They'd lost the war, although they wanted to think that they won the war. They saw it as a tactical retreat. But there was that defeat in Vietnam. And the CIA was wanting to get involved in Africa. And the Congress didn't want to get involved in Africa. So there was this ding-dong battle taking place in America. And Stockwell was he was the front guy. And in fact, to get an analogy for him, there was that Colonel Ollie North, that Marine officer, later on in another affair, the Iran-Contra affair. It was the same type of situation where he was the sort of this hawk running ahead of everyone else, trying to get to what evidence was needed for Congress to make the decision to commit forces. So it's much the same sort of thing. But the important thing is that this represented a split foreign policy in the United States. The United States were not supportive at all, and in fact, the United States wanted to isolate it. They weren't interested in the engagement, but he was trying to sort of find evidence to suggest that they should. So we just need to understand that, because it was not a monolithic thing, and they promised through BOSS and through various other things, other channels, they promised support, which of course never materialized. And after the Battle of Embrez, when it was clear that the artillery barrage with two guns, 255s, was insufficient to be a game changer, and at that point in time, the CIA upped sticks and they just disappeared, and they left the South Africans abandoned there. And now let's focus on that now, because now the South African force is abandoned. They've got two artillery pieces there, and the officer commanding of that, for the artilleryman, he said, no, we're not going to leave our guns behind. So they now start escaping and evading and actually making your way now down to a harbour.
There was an instruction was actually given by HQ that no South African identikit must be left behind.
Yeah.
So that the guns and everything had to be taken with us. We weren't allowed to leave anything behind. So Ruiz, right from the outset, just to clarify that, was totally against the way that the onslaught was going to take place. And he was actually overruled by politicians at the end of the day, because the politicians said, no, we want to remain in favor with FNLA, with Holden, because he is anti-Soviet, and let's just listen to what he has to say, and so on. So it's interesting that when that force went through to California, it wasn't led by military people. It was actually led by the governor of that area. Trying to think of his name. I think he was De Santos or something like that. But anyway, so and then there were, I don't know, maybe 1,000, 2,000 FNLA troops with all this ill-equipped hardware that they had, with cannons that exploded. It was an absolute mess. And the issue was that on the other side of this California wetland, it was high ground. So the MPLA had their Stalin organs positioned there. And so in the morning at 6, when South Africa came in with Canberras and bombed their positions, they scattered. And then Roos said, well, now we must go. Now is the time to cross the river and get through. And the troops said, no. Holden must first talk to us and tell us to do that. And then secondly, we haven't had breakfast, so we've got to have breakfast first. So by the time they got going, it was like 10, 11 in the morning. And that delay gave the MPLA the headwind to come back. And when we eventually went forward with the bit of equipment that we had, it was too late. And they really rained those red eyes onto us.
Okay, so this is a bit of a shambolic operation now. Things clearly the wheels are falling off here now. The CIA at this point in time up sticks and they disappear. They don't give any assistance to the South Africans to extract them as they agreed they would. So now the South Africans are up the creek without a paddle. They are in an illegal military operation. They've all got false identities, but they're very, very poorly done. At best, it's a mishmash of identities. So now the retreat has to happen because they can't get any more ammunition up there. So now you've got to have a retreat. So you go to Ambres, and there's this first attempt made. At this point in time, now you must speak to the Navy people, and they'll tell you now that that's the first time that they got involved, because they then got a signal to say they've got to go and uplift some South Africans from the northern part of Angola, and that then launched what became known as Operation Rubber Duck. But that's another matter. But now your side of that. So you get to Ambres now. So what happens at Ambres?
So what we had a communication unit, Kakixo, Caxito, Kakixo, something like that. And of course now the FNLA were running away. They just left their shoes, their weapons, everything. Even their vehicles.
It was a rout.
It was just like mutiny, and they left. And they ran away. We then got back to Ambres and realized, but where's this king air with all this equipment? And then we'd actually had, Brigadier Roos had actually had a meeting with them and said, listen, we could be in the Dwang. Would you mind taking us out and ferrying us maybe to Lobito if there was a problem? And it was agreed in an ops meeting, yes, they would do that. And yet they negated and they left us destitute there. So when suddenly that realized the panic stations were on.
Okay. Now this is where leadership kicks in now, okay? So now the plan's gone completely wrong. Suddenly you're up the creek without a paddle. It's an international incident that's now starting to play out in diplomatic circles. South Africa is an isolated and pariah state. There's all kinds of diplomatic things happening, but now the soldiers, the leadership comes out, okay? And the soldiers now start deciding they've got to get out, they've got to escape and evade, and they've got to get themselves down to a harbour town, and they've got to, they mobilize the Navy. In a very short notice, the Navy puts together a credible force. They go all the way up north, and they start trying to lift the South African troops off Ambres. And then what happens at Ambres?
Well, first of all, there was a minor attempt, and to actually make our own way independently without any help.
Okay.
So the whole idea was to annex a trawler out of Ambres to move ourselves and get away from that zone, because I mean now it was marked, and it was known that was Holden Roberta's centre at Ambres. So we just wanted to get out of there. But while they were trying to load the equipment, I'm not too sure whether it was what happened, but the equipment
swung away.
The equipment fell off the gangplank, if you want to call it, and lodged between the quay and the ship and damaged the ship. It was a wooden ship, apparently.
That's one of the guns, one of the big artillery pieces.
Yeah. So that put a spanner in the works. I believe there was an altercation with the captain, because he agreed originally and then said no, he's not going out with the damaged hull. The thing would sink. So that was, call it our own plan independently to try
That's
and get away.
a little place called Ambries. So then from
Yeah.
there, you moved to another little harbour.
No. Then that there must have been about a week where we were on tender hooks because we were trying to. They said they wouldn't send in aircraft because at that stage we knew that there were a whole lot of MiGs being built at Port Nori up in the Congo for
Onwa.
or whatever it's called, and then there were also MiGs being built in Luanda, and Orange. The guys in Orange had already had an encounter with MiGs, so we knew the MiGs were right on our doorstep there. So the South Africans said, no ways they're coming in with aircraft to lift us. That was the problem.
Okay.
So there was like this week of what do we call it? An intermittency.
A hiatus.
Yeah, where I think a lot of thought was given, and eventually there was Captain Kinghorn came in with a couple of guys, and they were sort of Navy sort of specialists, come recce guys, sort of came in to evaluate the situation to see what could be done. That's my interpretation of the scenario. And then I think he never realized, and they flew in, but they flew in with private aircraft, with let's say clandestine type aircraft. And they then, I think he suddenly realized, wow, this is a chamoch. And I know that when I spoke to Constance Verleen, he said it was one of the biggest nightmares that he had in his whole army career was to resolve this thing, to try and make sure that there was no loss of life in it. Anyway, Kinghorn came in, and him and Roos sat intensively for about 2 or 3 days, I know, strategizing, working on this thing. But while this was happening, there was a counter-insurge from the MPLA across the Kolofong to take Ambries. And while they were doing reconnaissance, they came into this, and they actually thought it was their own FNLA troops, and it wasn't. It was MPLA troops, and they actually got into one of these Soviet vehicles to speak to the guys. And in the meantime, it was MPLA people, so there was total confusion. But anyway, so then they decided no, and I think as a result of that, they then, because that was like the end of November, sort of like around about the 20th, if I remember correctly. They then decided their strategy was to bring a ship in. And so the ship came in, but the signal that we got that they felt it was too close to Luanda, it would create too much visibility, and the ship was a threat. They wanted the ship further north. So the decision was, okay, let's go to Ambrizette.
Ambrizette, a small little fishing port.
Yeah, it's not really a port. It was just like a beach.
Okay.
Yeah. So the problem was with that is that you needed transport. So we only had the MOGs that would pull the cannons to take with us, and the road was so terrible. It was like a tropical. It was rainy season. It wasn't easy. So that they felt would hinder us. So the cannons, breeches, and all the working parts were taken, so that they would be used, that they would be obsolete. And those were loaded and all the radio and the crypto stuff was loaded, and all that went up to Ambrizette. But there again, we were in communication with the boat on VHF, but they couldn't see us. And we were flashing, and we didn't want to send off too many flares because then it start attracting attention. So, but eventually with pencil lights and things, they saw us.
Yeah, this is also an important part from a historic perspective, because with Kinghorn there, who later on became a key player in 4 Recce, this is the early sort of origins of 4 Recce operations, trying to figure out how to navigate under these conditions, how to plan their exfiltrations from the beach and whatever, how to link up with the Navy. So it was an incredibly important. That's why I say this Battle of Ambries was, in my view, one of the pivotal moments in the Angolan War.
And the whole thing was also, I think originally the plan was to start at sunset, so that it was dark and you had the whole night.
Yeah.
But the problem was when we got onto site, then they said, no, you must move to Mbrizet. So that was like 60 k's. We had to go up north, and by that time it was midnight. And then there was this whole hassle of communicating with them and trying to get their attention. And then it was ferrying. They had rubber ducks that came in and fetched us, and a helicopter, and all that virtually took us into sunrise, which was very, very nerve-wracking in a way, because then we would have really been exposed, and the ship also wanted to get away from that area, totally, because they were actually in foreign waters now. So but fortunately all of us were airlifted and we got away. So
you got into the ship then?
We got into the ship, and then the captain just headed for sea, and we were so tired because we hadn't slept all night. We just dosed. We didn't care where the ship went to. But we eventually came out at Walvis, and at Walvis we disembarked, and the next thing there was a C-130 load, and we thought, now we're finished, we're going home. No ways, they put us into this flipping C-130 back to Sela.
Back to Sela.
That's another story.
And that's where the Battle of Ivo starts coming in now, because at this point in time, Sela has now become quite a hot little place. The Cubans have been deployed there. The Foxbat has now formed. And suddenly the advance north by the South African forces is brought to a grinding halt at the Battle of Ibo. In the Battle of Ibo, 4 of our people are left behind. One of them is Trooper Lombard, whose remains still to this day never been found, the so-called Ibo 4. But in that place now, let's just briefly talk about that, because there were some interesting things that happened there now. And there was this one engagement at a place called Top Hat. There was an engagement with Top Hat because, and there was also a very, very famous artillery man, and once again the artillery playing a role, Joffel van der Westhuizen. So talk about Joffel and talk about Top Hat, and there's also a very famous recce that you were involved with, that who eventually became one of the leaders of small teams operation, Diedrichs. So tell us about that.
We landed at Sela, but then they posted me to. So Sela had formed a Zulu group. And I think Zulu eventually became also part of Foxbat, but at that stage it was Foxbat at Santa Comba. And Santa Comba was, I don't know, maybe 20 k's down the road from Sela, from the hospital area. Anyway, so we were based there, and the comms were already in place. We were there just to facilitate and help and so on. But the biggest challenge with the whole of Bridge 14, I think I missed Ebo.
Bridge 14 was part of Ebo, so the Battle of Ebo resulted in Bridge 14. That whole sort of incident was around that one thing, okay? But the tactical problem there was that the South African artillery was outranged. So the only way that the South African artillery could make an impact was to rethink tactics using the old equipment. And that's where Joffel van der Westhuizen played an important role, and that's also where Diedrichs played a role, because Diedrichs was the forward observation officer, and he was relaying information back, because Joffel's team would actually advance way forward. Instead of flying over the heads of the others, he was actually in front of them, and that was a very important tactical move. But there was now this problem of the communications. So comms played a big role. So Diedrichs was talking to you, and then you were talking to these guys. So tell us that story.
Communication was huge, because you had Top Hat, and then you had Hippo Hill, and on the right there was Big Ben, if I remember correctly. And these hills posed a problem for communication.
For VHF comms didn't work.
Yeah, it was really a problem. So maybe I should just go back a little bit and say that the recce teams were out there. And I didn't know DD. All I knew is that we had to get comms with these guys. And eventually they said, right, we're putting you up at the top to put up a relay so we get decent comms. So that there was this communication. In fact, if I remember correctly, there was a recce team with old Sergeant Wannenberg, and he got killed there because comms were just horrible. They were terrible. So that was one of the sore points about Bridge 14, is that yes, there were some good things that they did too, but the comms were terrible. And so we tried to improve that.
Okay.
But going back to, I don't know Didi's story that well.
Yeah,
But
okay.
I know, but I can tell you my story.
Yeah, well, that's
is
really your story.
Yeah,
It's your story.
I was told to get up Hippo Hill
Okay.
to put up a relay there, and we had problems with batteries and things charging and that sort of thing as well. So we put the relay station up. But what was interesting is that I'd had a little bit of with Umbrez, a little bit of a psychological tremor, because you after an experience like that you're a bit shaky and so on, and so I had a little bit of a spiritual experience when I was there, and so they sent me up, and one of the things that I had a debate in my heart with God. I said to him, this is just coincidence that you saved me. You've got to show me that you're going to save me personally in this system. Otherwise, I don't know if I can really believe all this. So I climbed this hill all by myself, and I put up the relay and came down, and we battled with that relay all night there, and eventually got the thing working, and I came down, and it was just like sunlight back to where, let's call it, the fighting front was, although it was moving around all the time, but there was an area maybe like a little bit past the neck where the 5.5s were, and as I came back we suddenly heard these explosions, and we thought, yo, what's going on here? They're mortaring us now again. And this is where that trommel got all damaged. Was there at Ridge 14 area.
So that's the
shrapnel.
The shrapnel. There.
Yeah.
You will talk about the trommel now, but
Yeah,
let's just carry on with the story, and we'll get back to the trommel now.
So anyway, I got back, and then they sent a stick of guys out to go and see what was going on. And I had walked up this path, which was a cattle track, that night. Set the stuff up, the equipment, and came back and unharmed back into our area. And these cattle had walked the same path, and these anti-personnel mines, they'd trodden on them and they killed them. So that had a major impact on my life. And I said, it's a spiritual walk that we live in life. And I said, there's an answer to prayer, is that God has protected me as a person. And then, of course, I realized salvation, and it made a huge impact on my whole life, because as a result of that, I grew. I must tell you an interesting story right at that time. We had a Germany, a padre or chaplain.
Okay.
Yeah.
The chaplain general.
Yeah.
He was a senior chaplain.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm trying to think of his name now. I was got a blank. Anyway, so this was now a little bit later. This was when Ted Fountain and his crew were building the bridge, and their radios were shot out, and I had to get radios to them. So I'd been back to the Foxback, call it Echelon, got the radios, brought them back to give to the sappers. And as I'm getting there, we radioed and said, "Is everything quiet?" And they said, "Yeah, it's safe. You can come." So we came with our Gary, and I'd hardly put my foot out, and we started hearing, "Koo," and the guys just said, "Aardweg, run!" And the first little loopgraaf I saw was sort of off the road. I dived in there with these radios. It was Germany, Nordia.
Nordia, yeah.
And I dived with his radios on the back of his head. And I mean, it was like real impact. And he was like bewildered that he had this impact. It was like an oak hitting you with an okkiri,
Yeah.
And then I was bewildered. So I said to him, "Wat die duivel gaan hier on? What the hang is going on here? Because I was told there was no fire." So he looks at me like this. He says, and I'm going to say it in Afrikaans. He says, "Moenie so vloek nie, want hierdie goed gaan op ons val." So I couldn't believe, because everyone flukes when everyone swears in the army. So anyway, when I ran to their base where this little HQ was, I said, "Who's that hack over there that's moaning about fluking?" So they said, "No, that's the Germany. And why did you go into his trench? That's his trench." I've infiltrated his domain.
Now, the significance of this Germany is that when I was last with you, we linked you up to his son.
Yes.
Because his son was actually an operator, special forces, in fact, an interesting guy, special forces and MEC officer. And I had the privilege of working with him later on in my professional life. And it was very, very touching when we could actually connect you and him together. And we'll maybe one day talk about that aspect of the story, the human side of that, the Germany side and the spiritual side of it. But nonetheless, okay, so
as a result of that encounter, we built a bit of a relationship. And when we had no South African stuff, so he said to me, "Have you got a Bible?" So I said, "No." He said, "I'm going to tear out Romans chapter 8. You read that." And that had a major effect on me. If anybody wants to read Romans 8, just read it. It's amazing for that time. But anyway, that had an impact on me and had a change. But Bridge 14 was actually mostly worse than, because it was right there that we were involved, whereas with the Colofong thing, it was further back.
Yeah.
We hadn't actually really got there. It was the Stalin organs that were, but there they had mortars, they also had the Stalin organs, and it was almost, you were in trenches there for almost 48 hours being bombarded. It was really hectic. So, those were my experiences. I also had, it was sad that when they were about to finish the bridge and the sappers, there were 2 sappers taken out, and that had, and we knew them because I was working with Ted Fountain, because the comms with them was important to replenish their batteries and things, and then these 2 guys were taken out. It had an effect on us.
Okay, so what I'll try and do is Dominic Nodia. I talk to his son on a regular basis, and in his son's office he's got a photograph of that bridge you're talking about. So I'll try and get from him a photograph that will maybe attach to this interview, just to give it some sort of personal touch. And then if you can now just maybe tell us about this, because we're in the interest of time, we've got to start wrapping up now. So tell us the story about this trommel, and you already mentioned that this is a shrapnel thing now, but just tell us about this trommel now.
This trommel I got on the airstrip where they dumped all this equipment out of the C-130.
At where?
Up at Embrace.
Embrace. Yeah. So this comes with you all the way from Embrace.
So we packed our equipment, our signals equipment, in this trommel, even though it wasn't the South African trommel.
Okay.
And it loaded, it came with me, it went on the C-130 with me, back to, and then interestingly, in February, March, when this whole campaign had come to an end, now the Oaks, all the MPs, military police were eyeing this thing out and saying, I said, no, you can't touch it. This is, meantime, all I had is my toolbox inside, so you can't touch it. This is highly sensitive stuff, it's got to go back to Heidelberg. That's why you'll see it's got a Heidelberg written on there to get it back.
Okay, so in other words, if we forensically reconstruct this here, this batten used to be over the top there, and like that batten there, it had a metal clasp.
Yeah.
And that's been shattered off, so obviously the shrapnel came in this angle, hit that piece and sheared it off there, okay? Yeah. So there was quite a force, okay? And there's also another little piece there that flew out. So it's quite a little bit of damage there.
Yeah, absolutely. Fortunately, my head wasn't in the way.
Okay, so let's start wrapping up. I think we've got a lot of information. Just do you want to show some of your other little bits of memorabilia, just to we'll get some photographs of these things, and then we'll start wrapping up.
This is actually came out of a guy's pocket, and this came from Bridge 14. These guys that I've got here were actually killed in a pineapple field just on the other side of Bridge 14. So this just showed that in their membership and so on of the MPLA, which I've kept over the years. There were many that were actually killed at Bridge 14. I'd say at least 1,000 people, but this came out of their pocket, so this must have been his.
So that was the kind of thing in the pockets of the soldiers, and what's that?
And that was just another picture or a postcard that they did, and then this. And this was that that was the Gary, and then those are the guys that came up to relieve. But there's me in the centre there.
Okay.
And then there's a Foxbat group, but which I say also became Zulu because Blackie Swart was in charge of Zulu. But there's Mo. I worked with him.
Mo Olschick.
Yeah, and that was Captain Fenter, which I've lost.
Okay.
Not sure what his rank is today,
Okay.
but
Okay. Then there's one more bit of memorabilia about the spy that you caught. So, there was a spy. So there was a spy, a man undercover. I'm interested in counter-espionage. So you played a role in counter-espionage operations, and you found the spy. So tell us about the spy that you busted.
So what's interesting here, this guy's got a UNITA membership card. Okay, there's his name, there's his photo, and so on. Now in Santa Comba, we had Brush there, and Brush picked up that. That's another long story, but Brush were picking up that every time our Air Force went to collect or load off people, somehow the enemy knew of these movements. And so Brush picked this guy up. Although he was a UNITA member, he was transferring information, they caught him, to MPLA. So he was a UNITA sympathizer according to this document.
But he was a spy.
But he was actually a spy.
Embedded.
And if I remember correctly, I think there was a chap, they sorted him out. There was Johan Blau. I don't know. He was a problem, this guy, so they got rid of him.
Anyhow, okay, so I think that brings us to an end. So I started out by saying there were 4 pivotal battles in the Angolan War, in the Bush War. Today we spoke about 2 of those battles. Those battles were pivotal in many, many ways. The Battle of Kifangongo ultimately resulted in the Navy being deployed for the first time. You started seeing Captain Kinghorn from eventually becoming a key player in Fort Recce, getting involved in those sorts of operations. You saw the breakdown of the relationship between the CIA and the South African intelligence services. What was that boss at that point in time, later National Intelligence, where I used to work. And so very, very important things happening around that moment in time. And then later on, within the same time span, the shift down south to Ibo, where suddenly things happen in Ibo. The South African advance gets blunted, the forces get realigned, a whole lot of new tactics come out of there, and that becomes a game changer because for the first time the Cubans now become really a formidable force that will be encountered from that moment onwards, requiring different tactics, different strategies. And then into this whole mix you've got this thing about intelligence, about embedded spies, about how these people actually are game changers by giving tactical information where it's relevant. So thank you very much. It's been a fantastic interview, and we'll gladly have another one at some other time about your other interesting stuff. Before I go, I just want to say that it's been a privilege for me to sit in this chair, because this chair belonged to a family member of yours. I'm going to get up out of the chair, and I'm going to allow you to close off by telling us the significance of this chair. There we go. There we go. So tell us about
that. Well, that's for another occasion, but my great-grandfather started the Cape Town Highlanders, and this is an heirloom that's been passed on from one generation to the next. So this was his chair that he had down in Cape Town.
Well, it's very comfortable, and being an old chair doesn't creak at all, so it's fantastic. Thank you very much. That's it. It's a wrap. There, we've done it, but